Now let's consider what's going on with human populations. This is figure 5412 from your textbook in front of you right now. The x-axis is year, going as far as the present, or pretty close to the present here on the far right-hand side, and the y-axis is the human population size in billions as shown here. Considering what we've been discussing in terms of exponential growth or logistic growth, it should make sense to you in looking at this curve that this is like a classic exponential growth curve. So looking at this kind of exponential growth, one could also consider, well, how much has the population increased since this last number shown in 2011, where we were about at the order of 7 billion? One can go to various locations on the internet, such as this URL right here, shown down here at the bottom, and click on it and look at the current population. Let's go ahead and do that right now. Oop, there's the current world population. Looks like 7.3 billion. Oop, look at all those young being produced. How many births today? How many births this year? How many deaths today? Births are clearly greater than deaths today. B is greater than D. R is still positive. So, if we extend this then to 2015, then we go up to about 7.3 billion or so, this point right here. So we've got a little bit more of an increase here. Still exponential growth. Now, as mentioned before, exponential growth is not sustainable long term. Populations of any species can't just skyrocket indefinitely. One expects something eventually that looks more like a logistic growth curve, which is that the exponential growth will eventually flatten off and will reach a carrying capacity. So, if we reach carrying capacity, then this means that the increase has gone to zero. What does R look like anyway? This graph is not from your textbook, but I thought you'd enjoy looking at this because this is actually a graph of what R looks like as a function of year. This showed data as of 2009 with projected data. After 2009, I also found a number for 2012. I went ahead and pulled that out for you. So R, which as you may remember is the difference between per capita birth rates and death rates. So as long as it's above zero, the population is still increasing, and it's not until R would decrease as far as zero that the human population would no longer be increasing. So the peak of R was in about 1963 as shown here, and it has in fact been decreasing ever since. It has been heading down as shown here. So, what is our carrying capacity? As you can imagine, there is a range of estimates. It's not as if this is an exact or certain number. When we talk about carrying capacity, then we mean just on the Earth for humans specifically. And the range in these estimates depends on what's assumed for energy consumption rates, resource use, food consumption, waste production, and so on. Typical estimates on the order of about 10 to 15 billion. If you look at this curve and consider where 10 to 15 billion is on this particular graph, let's see, 7, 8, 9, 10, there's 10 there, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, it's sort of off the scale here. When do population ecologists predict that we'll reach such numbers? Well, in about 2050, or so. That is probably within your own lifetime, we'll reach such global population numbers. So how do these estimates relate to assumptions made in energy consumption, so on? It should make sense that the higher the numbers are for resource requirements, the lower the carrying capacity. And of course, the larger the population, the more the resources will be spread thinner in our populations. The United Nations has made projections for the human population, making assumptions for fecundity. So these high, medium, and low are making specific assumptions in terms of how many young females on the planet will have on average over the next few decades. This is figure 5413 from your textbook. So you can see that the fewer offspring per female over the next few decades, the lower the overall peak in human population size globally is expected to be, and also the earlier it will occur. So this low fecundity line, for example, is peaking both at a lower overall population size, but also earlier than the medium or the high fecundity extrapolations. Another factor that's important to consider in populations is the age structure. Figure 5411 in your textbook compares and contrasts the age structures in Sweden with Honduras. I thought you might enjoy seeing some additional populations for some other countries, so I pulled these out from other sources. It's the same basic kind of graph. Let's walk through this. Age structure population graphs like this typically separate out the males from the females, as shown here. So males are on the left, females are on the right. Age class is shown vertically. So we've got newborns, or the youngest age classes, down here at the bottom, and older individuals up here at the top. And then for both males and females, the bars show the overall percentage of the total population. You can see in all of these cases, the male and female halves of the curves are approximately symmetrical, meaning that males and females show the same pattern with age. This is typical for our species. It's not typical for all species. You might consider how this would look, or what differences you might expect for species in which males and females had very different mortality curves as a function of age. So for example, if males tended to die earlier than females, for example. Now notice how different these shapes are. In Afghanistan, for example, we have a really bottom-heavy population, or a young-heavy population, meaning that a smaller overall proportion of the population is of advanced age, and a much larger fraction of the population is younger. In the United States, we have a really different kind of pattern where it's actually pretty flat up until the 40s or 50s. This is data as of 2009. It's not really that different now, except, of course, we would have advanced by another 6 years. And notice that there is, in fact, this sort of bulge here at this age, but otherwise it's about the same, and then decreases with advancing age here. In Italy, we've got a similar kind of pattern, except a more strong bulge here in middle age, and a smaller proportion of the overall population is young, meaning under the age of 20, as shown here. So you might expect you'd have very different projections in terms of changes in population based on what proportion of the population is of a childbearing age, and what fraction of the population is of that age, and how many individuals there are. So, for example, if there's a larger number of individuals that are of childbearing age, that population would be expected to increase more rapidly than they would otherwise. So maybe make this a little bit easier to understand, let's draw some hypothetical curves on the far right-hand side here. So I'll go ahead and draw a line up here through the middle so we can draw what we'd expect maybe of males and females. So let's consider a case where year after year after year we have exactly the same pattern. So year after year, same exact pattern. The birth rate and death rates are not changing year after year after year. Then one would expect for a certain number of individuals born that over time you'd have fewer and fewer individuals, right? And so if there was relatively small amounts of mortality initially and then a sudden increase in mortality, we might expect a shape like this, right? Does that make sense? Just drawing something approximate, right? This is the kind of shape we would expect. This is supposed to be symmetrical, by the way. This isn't supposed to be more females. That's just my sloppy drawing. Here, let me clean that up a little bit. There we go. If they're year after year after year after year, if there's relatively low mortality, then you would expect every year the individuals in one particular class, the previous year or 5 years earlier, since these are going up by 5-year classes, then every 5 years you would expect this group to then graduate to be this group and this group to graduate to be that group and so on. If mortality is very low, then you wouldn't expect huge changes in numbers until a certain age was reached. As mentioned before, humans have that type 1 survivorship type curve where after a certain age there is a greatly increased mortality rate in older age, as shown here. So you certainly would not expect any kind of bulge like this. So when one sees a bulge like this, we know there has been some kind of change over time. This could either be a change in births or a change in deaths, but it should make sense to you that you can't end up with more 40 to 44-year-olds than 5 years earlier or in the 35 to 39 bracket, for example. So when one sees changes like this, then one knows there has been some sort of changes over the years that have caused this. So this is an indication of what? The baby boom, right? There was a disproportionately large number of young born right after World War II, and we see this as a bulge in the population at this particular age structure. Okay. If you understood that, then you should be able to do these next 2 clicker questions. Let's go ahead and start with this one. Consider the case of true, simple exponential growth. In exponential growth, R is a constant, and I'm reminding you of what R is here. It's the difference in per capita birth versus death rates, right? So you can write this either as little b minus little d, or capital B minus big D divided by the overall population size. So the blue line here on this particular graph, where the y-axis is population size and the x-axis is time, so this is an example of exponential growth. What is the value of R for the blue line? Is it greater than 0? Is it 0? Or is it less than 0? You should be able to answer that question. Go ahead and pause the recording now. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you were able to correctly identify that R must be greater than 0. Let's try another one. Now we're going to consider the logistic growth curve. That's the red line shown right here. It's the same graph we were looking at before. I would like you to consider what is the value of R, that is the difference in per capita births minus deaths, at these 2 points on the curve, point 1 versus point 2 over here. Would you expect comparing the value of R at this point here, consider this R1 versus right here at this point, you consider that R2. Would you consider them to be exactly the same? That R1 is less than R2, or R1 is greater than R2? You should pause the recording now. Welcome back. Hopefully you selected C, that R1 you would expect to be greater in magnitude than R2. And in fact, by the time you've leveled off the carrying capacity, which is where you are here at this point in the curve, R2 is 0.